There is a place in the southeastern corner of Saudi Arabia called the Empty Quarter, Rub al-Khali in Arabic, the name that the people who named it chose not because it was poetic, but because it was accurate. It is the largest continuous sand desert on the surface of the earth. It covers an area larger than France. In its interior, the dunes rise to heights that defeat navigation landmarks and create a geography that is the same in every direction for distances that exhaust the human capacity for orientation. The temperature in summer exceeds 60 degrees Celsius at the surface. There is no water. There is no shade that was not brought there by the people who required it. There is nothing in the Empty Quarter that was not placed there deliberately, at enormous cost, by human beings who had a specific reason to be in a place where no human being would otherwise choose to go. The reason, at the coordinates that mark the Shaybah oil and gas facility, is hydrocarbons. Specifically, approximately 30 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil sitting beneath the sand at depths that required technology that did not exist when the reservoir was first discovered, in deposits that required infrastructure investment that took 15 years and cost more than the gross domestic product of most nations to bring to production. The Shaybah facility is not a famous place. It does not appear in the ordinary geography of the conflict. It is not a port, not a strait, not a city. It is a cluster of processing units and storage tanks and accommodation blocks, and an airstrip in the center of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet, connected to the outside world by a single road that runs 550 kilometers north to the nearest inhabited area. It is also, by any rational assessment of the global energy system, one of the 10 most consequential pieces of infrastructure on Earth. Losing it, not destroying it permanently, simply interrupting its production and processing capability for the days or weeks that serious structural damage would require to repair, would remove approximately 1 million barrels per day from the global supply at a moment when the conflict had already reduced the availability of Iranian and Iraqi crude to levels that were moving the price of Brent crude past $110 per barrel and producing emergency reserve releases from every major economy. The Iranian planners understood this. They had understood it for years. The Shaybah facility appeared in the targeting doctrine of the IRGC Aerospace Force, not because it was achievable under normal circumstances. 550 kilometers of desert between the facility and the nearest Iranian launch platform was a range that made most drone systems operationally impractical. But because Operation Epic Fury had not produced normal circumstances, the degradation of Saudi air defense coverage in the eastern province, the reallocation of Patriot batteries to cover the higher priority targets along the Gulf Coast, and the operational demands placed on the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces by 14 consecutive days of drone and missile intercept operations had created a condition that the targeting staff at the IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters had been monitoring with the attention of people waiting for a specific window to open. On March 13, 2026, they assessed that the window was open. The drone package that lifted from 3 separate launch points in the southern Iranian province of Kerman at 8:44 p.m. on March 13th was not the largest package the IRGC had assembled in the conflict. It was the most precisely optimized. 22 Shahed 136 loitering munitions, configured for extended range operation by reducing their warhead payload in favor of additional fuel capacity, launched on a southern heading that took them away from the Gulf Coast and into the Empty Quarter on an approach vector that no one had used before because no one had previously believed the range was achievable. The flight profile kept the drones at 60 meters above the desert surface, low enough to remain below the detection threshold of the early warning radar coverage that the Saudi Air Defense Forces maintained along the Gulf Coast, which was oriented toward the northeast and had been designed to cover the approach corridors that previous Iranian attacks had used. The empty quarter approach was not one of those corridors. The first indication that something was approaching the Shaybah facility from the southwest came not from radar, but from the facility's own perimeter detection system, a network of ground-based sensors installed after the 2019 attack on the Abqaiq and Hurayz facilities that had demonstrated the vulnerability of Saudi oil infrastructure to drone attack. The perimeter system registered its first contact at 11:19 p.m. 3 contacts, close formation, bearing 240, range 11 kilometers. The facility's Security Operations Center transmitted the alert to the Shaybah Airstrip Control Tower and to the Saudi Ministry of Defense Eastern Command simultaneously at 11:19:31 p.m. The airstrip at Shaybah housed 2 assets that had been forward deployed to the facility at the beginning of the conflict in anticipation of exactly this contingency. A Royal Saudi Air Force detachment of 4 Typhoon Eurofighter aircraft on quick reaction alert and U.S. Air Force E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft that had been using the Shaybah airstrip as a forward operating location for its coverage of the southern empty quarter, a sector that had been low priority before the conflict and had become significantly more relevant as the IRGC demonstrated its willingness to attack targets across the full geographic range of its reach. The E-3 crew had been airborne since 6 p.m. and was orbiting at altitude when the perimeter system registered its contacts. The AWACS radar had not detected the incoming package at that point. The drones were below its effective detection floor at that range and altitude, but the perimeter system's contact report gave the E-3 crew a bearing and a range that allowed them to concentrate their sensor coverage on the specific sector. At 11:20:14 p.m., the AWACS radar acquired its first contact from the package, then a second. Then, as the beam dwelled on the sector, a picture that assembled itself over the next 47 seconds into the full scope of what was approaching. 22 contacts, spread across a front of approximately 4 kilometers, all at low altitude, all on the same bearing, all with a flight profile consistent with loitering munitions on terminal approach. Not 3, 22. The Typhoon detachment was airborne at 11:21 p.m. 2 aircraft scrambled on the contact report before the full picture had assembled, with the understanding that the specific number of inbound contacts was less immediately relevant than the fact that there were inbound contacts at all, and that the distance between them and the facility was shrinking at a rate that made every second of scramble time operationally significant. The remaining 2 Typhoons were at the end of the runway at 11:22 p.m., engines running, waiting for clearance that would come when the first 2 aircraft were clear of the departure path. The Typhoon pilots had the E-3's picture on their data links before they left the runway. The lead pilot assessed the geometry on his display during the climb-out and transmitted his engagement plan to his wingman in the economical language of a crew that had rehearsed this scenario. Split the formation, approach from opposite bearings to prevent the contacts from maneuvering off axis, prioritize the contacts closest to the facility perimeter, and work outward. His wingman acknowledged. They split at 8,000 feet. The first Typhoon engagement occurred at 11:23:41 p.m. An ASRAAM short-range air-to-air missile against the lead-in contact in the eastern subgroup, the drone that the E-3's geometry put as closest to the facility's eastern processing complex. The missile tracked clean. The contact disappeared from the picture at 11:23:49 p.m. What followed over the next 14 minutes was the most intense close-range air engagement over Saudi Arabian territory since the Gulf War. 4 Typhoon pilots working a picture of 22 contacts in a geometric space that was constrained by the facility below them, the altitude at which the drones were flying, and the specific challenge of prosecuting small, low-altitude, low-speed targets in the dark over featureless terrain with aircraft designed for a different threat envelope. The Typhoon was not built for this. Its radar and its missiles were optimized for engagements against fast-maneuvering aircraft at medium and high altitude. The Shaheds were slow, low, and non-maneuvering, a combination that was simultaneously easier to track and harder to engage cleanly because the intercept geometry required the Typhoon pilots to descend to altitudes that put them close to the desert surface in darkness, executing firing passes against targets that were barely distinguishable from the ground clutter on their radars. The pilots did it anyway. The facility's own defensive systems, 2 short-range Shaheds launchers installed after the 2019 attacks, and a Phalanx close-in weapon system positioned on the eastern perimeter, began engaging at 11:24:19 p.m. as contacts entered their effective range. The Phalanx was the most effective of the 3 in the specific geometry of the attack. Its radar and its engagement logic were designed for exactly the threat profile the Shaheds presented: slow, low, non-maneuvering. And it worked through the contacts in its engagement sector with the methodical precision of an automated system that does not experience the hesitation that human gunners accumulate under the pressure of a sustained engagement. At 11:28 p.m., 9 minutes into the engagement, the E-3 crew identified the critical problem. The 22 contacts had not been flying in a uniform formation. They had been arranged, deliberately, in the mission planning, in 2 groups. The primary group of 15 contacts had been the first detected, the first engaged, the contacts that the Typhoon pilots and the facility's Shaheds systems had been working against since 11:23 p.m. The secondary group of 7 contacts had been flying in the primary group's electronic shadow, positioned so that the radar returns of the larger group partially masked the smaller group's signature at the ranges and geometries from which the E-3 had first acquired the picture. By 11:28 p.m., the primary group had been reduced to 4 surviving contacts. The secondary group had separated from the primary group's shadow and was now approaching the facility's western perimeter from a bearing that the Phalanx system was not oriented to cover, and that the 2 Shaheds launchers on the western side of the facility had partially depleted their magazines engaging contacts from the primary group before the secondary group's existence was confirmed. 3 contacts from the secondary group were going to reach the western perimeter before any available intercept asset could reposition. The lead Typhoon pilot received the E-3's call at 11:28:14 p.m. He was at 3,000 feet on the eastern side of the facility, descending from a firing pass. He had 2 ASRAAM rounds remaining. He transmitted to his wingman, who was north of the facility, also low on ordnance, and pulled his aircraft into a hard left turn that put him on a heading toward the western perimeter at maximum sustainable speed. The geometry was unfavorable. He was going to be late. He was late by 11 seconds. The first of the 3 western contacts reached the facility perimeter at 11:29:47 p.m. and impacted the outer wall of the primary gas oil separation plant, the facility's largest single processing unit, the component whose loss would reduce Shaybah's production capacity by more than 60% and whose reconstruction timeline the Saudi Aramco engineering staff had previously estimated at between 4 and 7 months. The warhead was a reduced payload configuration. The range optimization that had allowed the drones to reach the empty quarter had come at the cost of explosive yield. The detonation was not catastrophic. It breached the outer wall of the separator housing and started a fire in the processing equipment exposed by the breach. The fire was significant. The second western contact was engaged by the Phalanx system, which had completed a sector reorientation at 11:29:51 p.m., 4 seconds after the first impact. The Phalanx destroyed the second contact at 11:29:54 p.m., 40 meters from the separator's eastern wall. The third contact was destroyed at 11:30 and 9 seconds p.m. by an ASRAM from the lead Typhoon pilot, who had arrived at the geometry with 11 seconds of margin that he had converted into 0 seconds of margin by the time the missile left the rail. The engagement was over at 11:31 p.m. 18 of 22 contacts had been neutralized before reaching the facility. 4 had penetrated, 1 impact on the outer separator wall, 1 that had been lost from the E-3's picture during the primary group engagement and impacted a non-critical storage structure on the southern perimeter, and 2 that had been engaged by the Shaheds systems at very close range, and whose warheads had detonated close enough to the perimeter that the overpressure and fragmentation pattern had damaged a section of the pipeline manifold that fed the separator complex from the wellhead connections. The Shaybah facility's production operations were suspended at 11:35 p.m. The fire in the separator housing was brought under control by the facility's emergency response teams at 2:17 a.m. The damage assessment conducted in daylight on March 14th documented the outer wall breach, the fire damage to the processing equipment inside the breach, and the pipeline manifold damage. The assessment team's preliminary estimate for production restoration, the time required to repair the separator housing breach, replace the damaged processing equipment, and repair the manifold, was between 6 and 12 days, contingent on the availability of the specific replacement components that the facility's logistics system did not stock in sufficient quantity for this level of damage. Saudi Aramco suspended Shaybah production formally at 6 a.m. on March 14th. The announcement moved the Brent crude price $11 in 40 minutes. The empty quarter had been unreachable. For 14 days, that assessment had been accurate. On the 15th day, the IRGC Aerospace Force had committed the planning investment and the drone inventory to demonstrate that the assessment was conditional, that reachability was a function of will and resources and the specific configuration of a defender's coverage, and that none of those variables were fixed. The Typhoon pilots had neutralized 18 of 22 contacts in 14 minutes over featureless desert terrain in darkness. That was a performance that any air defense professional would characterize as exceptional. The Iranian planners had designed a strike package in which exceptional performance still produced 4 impacts, because they had studied the Typhoon detachment size, estimated its ordnance capacity, modeled the Shaheds system's coverage geometry, and built a 22-drone package that would exhaust the available defenses before the last contacts arrived. They had not been wrong. They had been accurate about everything except the Phalanx reorientation time, which their model had estimated at 9 seconds and which the system completed in 7. 7 seconds against 9 seconds is a 2-second difference that converted a potential third separator impact into a destroyed contact at 40 meters. 2 seconds and 40 meters. The margin between a 6-day outage and a longer one. The lead Typhoon pilot landed at 11:47 p.m. with his ordnance depleted and his fuel at minimum reserve. He filed his post-engagement report at 1:20 a.m. It documented the contact picture, the engagement sequence, the ordnance expenditure, and the damage assessment as observed from his aircraft during the engagement. It noted that the secondary group had not been identified until 9 minutes into the engagement, and that this identification gap had allowed 3 contacts to reach the facility perimeter. It did not note the 11 seconds by which he had been late to the western perimeter intercept, because activity reports document what happened and not what almost happened, and the professional convention that governs the language of operational reporting does not include categories for the wait of 11 seconds. He knew the wait. He filed the report and did not speak about the wait because that is also a professional convention, and because the wait does not diminish with speaking about it, and it does not disappear with silence. It simply remains, carried by the person who carries it, added to the inventory of things that operational service accumulates over time, and that experienced pilots learn to place in the part of the mind that can hold things without being held by them. The empty quarter was not empty on March 13th. It held 22 drones and 4 Typhoons and a Phalanx system and the people who operated all of them, and it held the fire that burned in the separator housing until 2:17 a.m., visible from the airstrip as an orange column against the absolute black of the desert sky. It also held, in the sand somewhere in the 4 kilometers south of the facility where the intercept debris had fallen, the wreckage of 18 drones that had flown 550 kilometers from the Iranian province of Kerman and had not arrived at the target they were built to reach. 18 of 22. The empty quarter keeps what falls into it without ceremony and without record. The people who prevented 22 from becoming 22 know the number that matters. Not the 18, but the 4. And the 4 was the result not of failure, but of arithmetic that the Iranian planners had done correctly, and that the defenders had answered as well as their available assets permitted, and that the margin between those 2 facts was 2 seconds and 40 meters, and an 11-second gap that a pilot closed at maximum speed in the dark over featureless desert and was still 11 seconds too late. That is what defending the unreachable costs when the unreachable is reached.